In modern times, just as in the Victorian era, bread was an important food in everyday lives. Today, we have modern facilities of high standards, producing loaves to satisfy a variety of tastes in a £5 billion industry. Though with England rapidly industrializing during the reign of Queen Victoria, people needed bread like never before to satisfy their food requirements. Bread during the Victorian period was a staple required by most, with the average middle-class family of 6 consuming £55 per week, while using over half of their weekly income to purchase it. This is the equivalent of 31 modern loaves of bread. Even a laborer during the Victorian age would eat over 2 pounds of bread per day. Unfortunately, bakehouses did not keep pace with many other advancements during the Victorian era, leading to very harsh working conditions. Far too often, bakers during the reign of Queen Victoria would suffer severe illnesses and even death from their dangerous trade. A Victorian baker's impossible day from dusk to dawn to dusk. As a baker in the urban environment of the 1870s, your workday usually began late in the night at 11 p.m. to satisfy the demand for breakfast meals. You would hope that all ingredients required to begin baking were at hand when you entered the bakehouse, which was a chore in itself. Next, starting and loading coal-fired ovens would be a primary challenge involving hard physical labor. One would assume that the sponge would have been set in the kneading trough by a foreman before your arrival. This essential mixture consisted of yeast and flour that fermented and expanded. Next, you would handle heavy flour sacks of around 280 pounds, whose contents would be added to the sponge mixture along with water to make the dough come together. Then, you and other bakers would begin the arduous task of kneading the dense, heavy dough, which required tremendous strength and perseverance. After overcoming the physically strenuous task of kneading dough, it was left to prove. At this time, your weary body would be lucky to snatch a couple of hours of uncomfortable rest while the dough would rise. Since business owners often locked bakers into the premises, leaving for a few hours was not an option. If a fire, suffocation from heat, or dust occurred, you could lose your life inside these secured premises. When you woke, the dough would have to be weighed and hand-formed into quarterns, mound-shaped white loaves which weighed about 4 pounds each. On average, a working man in the Victorian period would eat 4 quarterns each week. Along with making rolls and fancy breads, the baking process in a working environment of up to 90 degrees Fahrenheit would continue until around 8 a.m. the following morning. Already a grueling 9-hour baking process from sponge to baked loaves, your demanding workday was still not over. Selling bread from shops was not a common occurrence in the 1870s. Therefore, all these goods had to be delivered. Junior bakers would have more physical exertion ahead as they carried many loaves to customers at residences and factories in baskets or wheeling carts. Upon greeting their customers, loaves would be weighed in their presence, as required by law. Underweight loaves or neglecting to weigh them in front of customers would carry a stiff fine. Only after what could be an 18-hour workday would this strenuous shift end. The true price of Victorian bread: illness and an early death. This overwhelming workload was extremely challenging, both physically and mentally. There are numerous accounts about the bad health of baker journeymen which resulted from continuous overwork. In many instances, they were forced to leave the trade after suffering from any number of illnesses. Afterwards, physically unable to seek another job or trade, they would collapse into a life of severe poverty and their eventual demise. Victorian bakehouses in urban areas were extremely damaging to the health of these men and women bakers. Constantly breathing in flour dust, they developed baker's lung and occupational asthma. With constant exposure, this condition became severe and persistent, even leading to death. In these cramped bakehouses, often having no ventilation, there would be a variety of other pollutants attacking your health. This included regular accounts of breathing in a sulfurous odor inside the bakehouse. Also, high temperatures and pollutants from coal ovens, dust from ingredients and other irritants compromised the air bakers breathed. Let us not forget the polluted air of industrializing Victorian cities where bakers worked and lived. According to one study from this period, of 111 bakers, 108 suffered from moderate or severe lung illnesses or disorders. In another study from that period, 2/3 of bakers had health problems, including asthma, rheumatic fever, consumption, tuberculosis, skin disease, heart disease, and lung disease. Of these afflictions, lung disease, heart disease, and consumption were often fatal over time. This continuous hard labor would also lead to physical health issues. Stoking fires with coal, constantly filling ovens with loaves of bread, and regularly moving 280-pound sacks of flour would cause serious strains and stresses. When one returned home, it was usually in a slum location. Their dwelling would consist of a cramped room or a few rooms where one often lived with vermin and no running water for proper hygiene. Working many hours of hard labor each day, bakers should have had proper nourishment. Unfortunately, this was not the case. Their diet was limited to bread as a food staple and perhaps a pork product like bacon. Even if they managed to get a carrot or potato to eat, they were challenged on how to cook it with only a small fire. Bread took 1/3 of a worker's daily wages on average and was not enough for proper daily nourishment. Therefore, malnutrition in a very labor-intensive occupation would contribute to illnesses and even premature death over time. According to some statistics from the period, a Victorian baker had a life expectancy on average of just 42 years. A Victorian bakehouse earned a penny every which way. During the 1870s, England's baking industry in urban areas was very competitive, with businesses struggling to turn a profit. Ruthless competition on price by undersellers meant bakehouses squeezed out savings wherever possible. For example, the same number of staff were expected to work much harder over time to increase food production and save their jobs. While actions like these would press bakers to their physical limit, owners had advantages. There were a plentiful supply of labor, with over 14,000 baker journeymen in London alone. This allowed owners to pay low wages, so that in the mid-1870s, bakers' hands earned less than factory workers, even though they worked longer hours. Employing bakers was cheaper than purchasing machinery, and these people were desperate just to hold a job. Journeymen had little to no capital for acquiring premises, so they had no alternative but to work for these business owners. They had no control over their working environment, which was in many instances a windowless cellar. These premises were cheap to rent, though dirty and often inhabited by vermin. A game of chance for Victorian baker customers. Bakehouse owners resorted to underhanded methods for staying in business. There were undersellers competing solely on price, which meant competition had to match or lose customers. Cheaper labor and longer hours could only go so far to decrease costs. So, many bakehouses looked to lower their expenses further by adulterating their ingredients. With little enforced regulation of pure state ingredients over most of the Victorian period, there were no real consequences to prevent this harmful practice. The least of a Victorian bread eater's worries was to consume a loaf that looked cooked on the outside, though doughy inside to increase its weight. At that time, the biggest cost for a baker was flour, with one sack equaling 5 times the weekly wage of a junior baker. To save on expenses, it is estimated that chalk was added to form 10% of this adulterated flour mixture. Chalk also whitened its appearance. Milk was watered down to create even more savings for the bakehouse. Now for more serious tampering. Alum, an aluminum-based compound, was used as a flour enhancer. It too made bread appear whiter, though also allowed flour to be more absorbent of water. This relatively inexpensive ingredient allowed the adulterated mixture to weigh more per loaf and save costs on expensive flour. Therefore, profit margins improved by using this dry, smelly product. In addition, millers themselves would oftentimes adulterate the flour with alum before delivering it to the bakehouse. One account in the Lancet Medical Journal stated that every single loaf of bread baked in London contained alum. Using alum for making bread led to a host of health issues for its consumers, including malnutrition, bowel issues, and chronic diarrhea, which was often fatal for children. Since many of the bakehouse customers were also impoverished, feeding them adulterated bread, their main source of nourishment, was dangerous and in various cases deadly over time. Bakers working in urban areas during the Victorian period suffered under appalling conditions in a trade that did not compensate or protect their basic occupational care. In many instances, they were viewed by bakehouse owners as cheap, expendable labor. When one considers that bread was the staple that powered many workers of the period, this harsh treatment of Victorian bakers was shameful. Thank you for supporting us at Victorian-to-Modern. Please be sure to watch another episode shown at the end of this video. Also, be sure to like, subscribe, comment, and click the notification button so we can create more exciting content. I wish you good tidings as we remember that sharing knowledge has been a noble deed throughout the ages.